I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Back in 2010, I attended Robert McKee's legendary 4-day screenwriting course called Story. I remember shivering in that freezing LAX Sheraton ballroom with 200 wannabe screenwriters. I wasn't there to write the next Lawrence of Arabia, but to learn what Hollywood knew about storytelling that I could use in the branding and advertising world to be more effective connecting with my audiences and actually moving people to action. Well, of all the incredible storytelling insights he shared, one particular sentiment has hung with me. McKee said that our conscious mind is simply the PR department for our subconscious mind, where all of our real decisions are actually being made. It made total sense to me because, in the advertising world, we know we all buy with our hearts and we justify our purchases with our heads. We tell ourselves emotional, fictitious stories as to why we need to buy something, and then we create nonfiction in our brains to counteract any buyer's remorse we might experience. Well, why is this important? Because when you are trying to get any audience to buy into anything, don't lead with facts, stats, data, and opinions in your communications. Start with a story that connects with our emotional subconscious, and then let your audience back it up with their conscious mind. Now, recently, I got a chance to test this hypothesis at Target Training International in Scottsdale, Arizona, where they snapped a bathing cap-like apparatus on my skull with 57 electrodes to measure my emotional quotient, or what is called emotional intelligence. Your EQ is the level of your ability to understand other people. Now, for most people, emotional intelligence, or this EQ, is more important than one's intelligence, IQ, in attaining success in your lives and in your careers. As individuals, our success and the success of the professions that we pursue today depend on our ability to read other people's signals and react appropriately to them. Our optimal personal performance is often measured most accurately by how we score on our emotional quotient. I think of EQ as a measure of how well you read other people and accurately identify their story. The test they gave me at TTI measured my initial emotional response to a stimuli, which, my gut instinct, and then they compared it to my immediate second response, which is more logical. They look at how similar these two reactions are, or they look at the gap between them. We tell ourselves one story, but actually believe something different. Our emotion versus our intellect. Which is fact and which is actually fiction? Well, you can take your own emotional quotient study online for free right now after the show, thanks to a special link made available to our Business of Story listeners. Just type in the bit.ly link, bit.ly/your TTI. That's bit.ly/YOURTTI. And you can get that at the Business of Story in the show notes there. Now, I'm especially excited about today's guest because he will take us inside the brain, sharing what they have learned over the past 6 years on how we process stories to live our optimum life. Plus, I've been given the great honor to present our proven story cycle system at their annual TTI Success Summit beginning January 11th, 2019. My session is actually the following day on the 12th. but you can attend their 30th annual Evolution of Excellence Conference by registering at ttisicon.com. That's ttisicon.com. Joining us today is Dr. Ron Bonnstetter, Senior Vice President of Research and Development for Target Training International and Professor Emeritus of University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Dr. Bonnstetter is an internationally respected researcher on the brain and human behavior. Current research pursuits include the development of biology-based communication strategies, organic storytelling, if you will, peak performance in the brain, development of personal attribute soft skills, and brain-based findings that inform human interactions. As a professor and lecturer, Dr. Bonnstetter was the very first recipient of the National Senior Outstanding Science Educator of the Year Award. So, without further ado, please welcome to the Business of Story, Dr. Ron Bonnstetter. Dr. Ron, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I had so much fun 2 days ago. I was over there, fought my way through Tropical Storm Rosa and all the wet and the traffic to get out to your offices in North Scottsdale and put on the cap and go through the whole brain scan. I think you call that the electroencephalogram, to see how my brain was firing. And this isn't about the health of the brain, I don't think, but more about how it is reacting to different stimuli. Is that right?
That's right. What we're really looking at is the emotional load associated with a decision.
An emotional load associated with a decision. We're going to come back to that, folks, because you're going to find Dr. Ron's going to throw out a lot of this really interesting stuff that we're going to unpack. But let's take a step back just a moment. Now, I first learned about your organization through Arizona State University when I was teaching the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership program. I was teaching communications, and I had the opportunity of working with a wonderful guy, Dr. Kevin Gazzara. And Dr. Kevin has been using your TTI assessment programs for a long, long time. And in fact, we use them on our students, or they got to take them so that they could have a better understanding of their leadership capabilities and how to optimize their performance. And I'd heard about the brain scanning technique and all of that. And it's really fascinating how you are able to quantify, actually in interesting ways, how our brains tell us stories. And these could be competing stories, from our subconscious telling us one story, but our frontal cortex, our conscious mind, telling us something completely different. And you guys are a little bit like detectives, I would say, if I've got that right, that goes in and scans and records this of what you did on my brain just 2 days ago.
Yeah, and we actually then have people take our assessments while they're hooked up so that we can do a correlational study and examine when you correlate with the answers you put on paper and when you don't. And then, of course, a story emerges from all of that.
And these, your trimetrics assessments, are they like a Myers-Briggs? Are they in that same genre? How would you describe them?
Well, it's interesting. When you make that comparison, Myers-Briggs is a wonderful parlor game. It's not in the same vein at all. Myers-Briggs makes it perfectly clear that this is not to be used for hiring. It puts stipulations on that because its intent is really solely awareness. And it plays a wonderful role in awareness. On the other hand, we are really moving at a different level, and the assessments that are used in business have massive databases behind them so that they actually are able to be used for selection. They are able to be used for professional coaching, and they offer a lot more insights than you get out of the standardization that would come out of something like a Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs has a place, but not in the market that we work.
Yeah. Now, you have not always been in leadership coaching. You started as a professor at the University of Nebraska, or were there, I should say. You've got your PhD in science education and electrical engineering. Have I got that right?
Well,
or energy engineering?
Both. I have degrees in biology, geology, energy engineering, environmental engineering, and science education.
You were teaching at University of Nebraska before you came into the leadership realm. How and why did you make that transition?
I'm a lifelong learner, and, I've loved every job I've had for 3 weeks. So I tend to outgrow things. And
ADD?
well, maybe a little bit, yeah. But I was at the university 29 years. And during that time...
What were you teaching there?
Well, I was director of secondary science education. So everyone that was going to be a science teacher got stuck with me. And so I had all the subject area people, and it really helped to have degrees in multiple areas so that I could address them both in terms of their content and their pedagogy. But my purpose was to try to build a pedagogy so that they would be effective teachers in the classroom. And I think what was really different about me was that I really approached my preparation from a different angle. I approached it from a scientific angle where my goal was really to build dendrites, to build and have them understand how protein markers are created in the brain.
What's a dendrite?
Oh, well, every neuron has this little web of roots at the end of it. Mm-hmm. And when you learn something new, you literally create a new connection. And so these connections are at the end of our neurons, and they're referred to as dendrites.
Okay.
So these are beautiful things that as we learn new things, we get new dendrites.
So is this where you were connecting both of your disciplines of science education, your PhD in science education and energy engineering? Because literally we are just walking masses of energy, and those dendrites are the connective tissue, I guess, of energy being going from one portion of our brain to another that we use for learning and memory and those sorts of behavior change. So were you combining those two worlds of this energy engineering psychology to teach science teachers how to become better science teachers?
Yeah, and I would also throw in a very hefty load of biochemistry as well, because we really needed to realize the role of hormones and make sure that we really were addressing how short-term learning can be turned into long-term learning, mm-hmm. and how to build memories, basically, and retention of information. And so, yeah, I really approached it more as a scientist than maybe a behavioralist. And so that was both good and bad. I was a little bit of a different animal, but I think it opened the door to my students and myself to how you can really get people to remember things.
And what were you finding were the biggest challenges in teaching these teachers to be effective and operate at their highest performance that your process helped them overcome?
I think I probably learned early on that there was nowhere in the educational system where a person had an opportunity to directly learn about themselves. And so self-awareness was really at an all-time low. And I have to say that I approached that thinking totally that I was helping my students, only to have the first aha was the realization that I didn't really understand myself. So two things came out of that.
So in understanding yourself, then you understand how you can become a better teacher or a better physicist or a better communicator or a better whatever you want to be in this world. But is it that we are so educated, the higher up the realm you go of education from master's to PhD, that we start thinking very much left-brained versus really understanding the emotional quotient of our right brain and how we present ourselves in the world?
I think that's true. We probably end up isolating ourselves from, and science is guilty of this. Science really attempts to sterilize their quotients, and in the process, too many scientists fail to realize that science is gray. It's not black and white. It's gray. And so there's so many components that get left in the dirt in our attempt to understand and in our attempt to explain, and we forget to spend time on what we don't know. We spend time on what we do know.
That totally makes sense. It's like I spend time on my golf game complaining about the crummy shot I just made versus spending more productive time on how did I actually do that really good one.
Yeah.
So You must have gotten some pushback on this a little bit, because it sounds like you were approaching this as a scientist and not a behavioralist. You probably had HR there breathing down your neck. What did you do to help them overcome this that then led you into leadership training, assessments and training?
Oh, well, let's back up a little bit. This is about stories. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of a story that lays out here, okay?
Sure.
So to start with, I've explained that I really did come out of the hard sciences rather than out of a teacher's college. And so my preparation really was based in the hard sciences. And yet I ended up then running a secondary education program. And so you would think that the hard sciences, I had a clear path to just quantified factual information. But then along comes my older brother, 12 years older than I. And, he's in business and he has these new assessments that he's excited about. And so in the process of talking with him on a daily basis, I start to realize that my teaching isn't effective as I thought it would be, because I knew all this stuff, but that doesn't mean that I was able to communicate it.
And your brother Bill was in the leadership development side of life. That's
correct. And he had these assessments at the time, starting really with behaviors. So in 1984, the two of us sort of started on a research agenda where he says, you really ought to use my assessments to help your students better understand self. And so I ventured into that with the goal of helping them understand self. In the process, the first thing I discovered is that if you imagine a wheel and you place everybody on this clock face of this wheel, and I had all of my students really were from 11 o'clock over to 7 o'clock. They were on the left side of the wheel. And here I am over at 2:30 extreme. And I was such an anomaly from the students I was teaching. And so it started to open doors that, wow, I see the world differently than them. Or more importantly, they see the world differently than I. And so we weren't communicating. I was the problem. And I hadn't even realized that. So in the process, I started to really design curriculum and design experiences that were more addressed to the needs of the audience. And I'll tell you, this ought to hit a home with anybody in sales, because if you do not really identify the needs of a customer, you're never going to sell them anything.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, I was not selling my knowledge because I had no idea how they were interpreting what I was doing. So this opened up some wonderful doors. I ended up writing up what I was doing because I was I get passionate about things, Spark. So I started to write up what I was doing because I was excited about this new understanding I had about how to get content across. And I ended up getting some notoriety. And I didn't really intend for this, but, I guess I still applied. I didn't think it would happen, but I ended up getting the Outstanding Teacher Preparation Program in the nation. And was in Washington, D.C., where Carl Sagan handed me an award, and that was a wonderful experience. But it also, behind stage, was the first time I used a term that, until that point, had not come out of my mouth. When Carl said, "Tell me about this award and what it is you do," and he wanted an elevator pitch; it had to be short. And I said, "Well, I actually teach the science of self." And so I help my students with the science of self.
What year was this that Carl handed you that award?
1986.
1986. So you, not intending to get this, you had quite a lot of success with it. And was it just simply because other large universities like University of Nebraska weren't approaching it this way? Was it your approach? And did you get any pushback on your approach, even though you won the award?
Yeah, you and I have had a little sidebar on this. I was an anomaly, and one of my grad students recently reminded me of a statement. He says, "I often think about a statement you told me." He said that when you're leading a parade, you got a great view, but you also make a great target.
Yep.
So he reminded me of that. And when I came back to the university with my little plaque, eventually somebody said, "You ought to really present to the faculty what it is you do." So I started to show how I gave these self-reporting assessments to my students. I debriefed my students, and that I worked my curriculum around the unique audience that was in that room. And about 3/4 of the way through that talk, the dean stood up and put his hands on the table and leaned forward toward me and said, "We do not use tarot cards for decision making."
We're serious after all.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is that as I listened to that statement, I had two reactions. First of all, my reaction was, "You're wrong and you don't get it." But my other reaction was, "You're right. I don't have the evidence to show you that what I'm doing is correct." So in the business world, what sells is what works. In academia, if you can't prove it, you can't use it. And so there's a different standard in academia. And so I decided to take that challenge on. And so I changed my research agenda at that point and started to seriously look at decision-making pathways, and could I document that what people put on a paper was coming directly out of their brain, and I could actually see that.
And Dr. Ron, had you had much experience with this sort of, electromagnetic encephalogram stuff leading up to this?
No, I was pre-med at one point, and I actually thought about going into medical education before I finalized on science education. So I had some awareness of the field, but no, I had no background whatsoever. So I started to go out and interview and talk to people and share my vision and share what I was trying to do. I would say that at least a dozen times people would say, "Very interesting. I don't see how we could interface to help you, but best of luck." And then I ran into a gentleman at the University of Nebraska Med Center in Omaha, who was at that time the director of the epilepsy lab. And I explained it to him, and he said, "I will help you if you help me." He said, "I have residents that are not good communicators. They're not good questioners." He said, "I have a feeling that one of the things you teach in your program is questioning and listening. If you help my residents be better at that, I will help you understand the brain better." So every Tuesday for 2 or 3 years, I would go over to the med center and spend the day, and had permission from patients who would sign off on me because I had no medical degree. So they signed off on allowing me to read their files, to be a part of the grand rounds, and to be part of the daily debrief on patients. And in the process, I learned to read EEGs, and I learned about the brain in ways that were tangent to what I wanted to do, but were still the basic foundation of what I needed to know.
And this is in the late 1980s, after Carl Sagan had given you that award in 86. You come back, your university president says, "That's okay, great, whatever, prove it." And so you are now in the epilepsy ward there, working on your thesis then, testing this out to see if you can figure out how you can actually quantify the success of these assessments.
That's correct. And I have to say that it was not a fast and easy road. There was a massive learning curve. And frankly, the protocols were not in place. The software was not in place. The hardware was not in place. This was not an easy thing. In a way, I was asking a question that the technology was not advanced enough to answer in meaningful ways. Yes, we had MRIs. Yes, we had fMRIs. We had PET. We had these tools that are clinical, but none of them were really looking at the instantaneous, real-time decision-making process. They were looking at the aftermath. Where's the blood flow? Where are events occurring that are showing up in the metabolism? I needed to look at EEG. I needed to see real-time electrical charges taking place. And what was really fun is that, obviously, when I was at the university, I have to admit I was more of a teacher than a researcher. I had over 60 master's students. I had 9 PhD students. I had my undergrads and my grads that I taught methods. I didn't have a lot of time for my research. So when I retired for a full weekend, in which I really left the university and came down here, where my brother allowed me to open my lab and to see how we could integrate what they did with these assessments that are used in business and my research in neurology, or more precisely, cognitive neurology.
And what year was that you moved down here?
I moved down in 2011.
So you retired for 2 days in 2011, moved to Phoenix, and kicked into Target Training International.
Yeah, and we haven't looked back. Since that time, we have 2 patents. We have another patent pending. We have done things that no one else has done. It's put me on stages all over the world explaining this protocol of asymmetry in the prefrontal cortex and looking at gamma wave activity. It has just been a beautiful trip, and it has put us in a position of thought leadership in the field that other assessment companies, I think, would envy.
So how did you get to creating the software and the product that you now use that I went through 2 days ago to scan your subject's EEG? I'm just going to go with that.
There you go. Yeah, let's make it simple.
Yeah.
Park, there's a part of me that believes I'm a scientist. But once in a while, when opportunities fall in your lap, you need to take advantage of them. You need to be aware that this is a moment in time that needs to be pursued. I don't know if that makes sense, but let me give you this story.
And before you do that, here's why it totally makes sense outside of the science world and probably into the more woo-woo world for what some people might call woo-woo. But Joseph Campbell, America's foremost mythologist, who I'm a big believer in the hero's journey and this template, this framework to story that our brains just happen to love because it helps us make meaning out of the madness and chaos of being human beings. He says, when you follow your bliss, the universe will open doors where there were only walls before. So what it sounds like to me is you retired for all of 2 days in 2011, and you were fascinated by what you could possibly do with these EEGs and this amazement assessment tool that your brother Bill had. So you left your ordinary world of teaching at University of Nebraska, and true to the hero's journey, you stepped into this extraordinary world, retiring, leaving everything behind, moving to Phoenix, and continuing to build on this program that in your heart, in your guts, you felt like this is the right direction, but your scientific mind isn't absolutely proofing that out. So you had to follow your courage to do this, and then this next scene occurs. Just like he says, the universe will open doors where there were only walls before if you have courage to take your trek.
Wow. Yeah, you certainly summarized everything up to this point. So I guess I would add that I did really, truly in my heart believe that what we were doing here worked. And I also wanted to be able to share that with others. And I knew that I couldn't share it with others unless I could come up with some proof. So here's the serendipity. I go to a workshop, a national workshop here in the Valley on EEG, because I wanted to train my assistant. And so the two of us go to the workshop, and I'm bringing him up to speed, but everybody at that workshop said they were going to another conference after this workshop that I knew nothing about. And so I started asking questions, and they said, well, yeah, we have the International Society for Neurology and Neurological Research that's occurring next week. And so I went home and I told Bill, my brother, about this conference, and he said, well, where is it? I said, it's right next door. It's at Carefree Resort. It's like a mile from our home. He said, well, let's go over and just wander in. So we're not registered. We don't even know which door to walk in. And I walk in and I look around, and all of a sudden I see a booth that has the equipment that I'm using in my research. Now, the equipment is not doing what I want it to do, but it's what I have.
And these are the skull caps with the electrodes on it, that kind of equipment?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was using something called Brain Avatar and a discovery system. So I walk over and I said, I'm so-and-so, and I'm trying to do ERPs, event-related potential, using your equipment, and I'm having tremendous difficulty. Well, this gentleman by the name of Tom Kalura is running the booth, and he says, well, I own the company. He said, I'm intrigued with your question. Let's go over in the corner and talk a little bit. We stood over at one of those little cocktail round tables for 2 hours where he drew and mapped out how the changes in the software could be made so that his tool could do what I want. He got as excited about it as I was. And so he said, let's make these modifications in my software. I think the hardware will work. And he said, we're not done today. So can we meet Wednesday morning on a conference call to see what we do next? That was 2011. Tom and I have been on a conference call every Wednesday morning since 2011, working on a continuation of this research agenda. We are no longer alone. We have on average 10 to 15 people from all over the world that join us on a Wednesday morning conference call.
And so now you've got your baby in place. You've got the technology and the software, and it's working for you. What does it actually do, and how does it help vet out these assessments or bring the science to these assessments that proof out, to the academia world, the science world, or any doubter out there that these tools actually work?
Yeah. So we're really collecting both the qualitative data and quantitative data. So we're getting images that are absolutely gorgeous images, and we're getting quantitative data on microvoltage changes that I can also examine and study. I would say that this is not a standalone, just like assessments are not a standalone. You have to use that in conjunction with other things. Our brain research is not a standalone. It is worked in conjunction with our statistical analysis, our factor analysis, our factor loading, our item analysis. All of the other statistical runs that we do on our assessments on an ongoing basis are then enhanced by this triangulation of looking at the brain responses from individuals as they take the assessment. Some of the insights that we get, for example, one of the initial insights was that when I had people answer what they're most like and what they're least like on a 1 to 4, they had to select things. I was able to match up what they're most like about 86% of the time between the brain and what they put on paper. I could match virtually 100% of the time what they said they weren't. And then I get into the literature, and the literature says, yeah, humans had to survive, and the survival components that required that we react quicker and with a stronger intensity to dislikes than likes. So we have a direct pipeline that kicks in place for aversion. Acceptance is a slower pathway, and it's not as clear a pathway.
And so what your system allows you to do, and you have scanned hundreds and hundreds of subjects. Now, you don't take the assessment and have your brain scan at the same time. Most people around the world just take the assessments. But what you're using with this pool of subjects, like I added to on Tuesday, is being able to see the overall trending of how the mind answers questions. Sometimes it believes it's answering it truthfully, and yet the subconscious is firing up, suggesting that what the conscious mind is saying is actually not the truth, that something else is going on behind the scenes. That's when you say you can match it up 86% of the time. But our aversion, as you see, again, lit up on the screen, you can match that 100% of the time. So someone maybe in Indonesia, an executive over there, is taking your trimetrics assessment, and the leadership coach or counselor that is working with them can look at that trimetrics assessment for them. They will never have their head scanned, but comparing to the baseline of information that you have from this pool of hundreds of scans, they then have a greater confidence in the accuracy of that assessment that they have just given to their Indonesian executive. Do I have that right?
I think that's it's a beautiful sales pitch, but yes, I think that's the essence. In other words, this is not a tool that we're going to go out and run on an executive in an executive coaching situation. We are doing this to make the assessments better. We're doing this for constant improvement. So even the assessment you took the other day, I have some hypothesis as well as some preliminary data out of the people we've already run, that out of those 57 items that you experienced, we already have 4 categories that are emerging. We have items that match perfect with what you said on paper and what your brain said.
Okay, now I haven't heard your reveal of this, so our listeners are going to hear it for the first time, just as I am. So I'm curious, what did you find from my assessment?
Your assessment was actually pretty clean. In other words, when you said something was negative, or you had it a 5 or a 6 on a Likert scale, or a 1 or a 2, both ends of that spectrum flipped back and forth between your right and left hemisphere beautifully. And so it was right on target. And when you had something that was labeled a 3 or a 4, in other words, on a Likert scale from 1 to 6, it was dead center, your brain flipped back and forth between the two. And so yours didn't show all 4 of the outcomes. Yours was more confirmatory.
What are the 4 different outcomes?
Well, one of the other outcomes we are labeling socially acceptable answer. In other words, your brain says one thing, but you go, I think this is really what they would like me to say. And that means that's an assessment item we may have to reword so that we get truth.
Do you have an example? Whether mine or somebody else, can you give us an example of what that is, how that reveals itself in your assessment?
Yeah, let's say I'm well liked and everyone finds me friendly. We get some people that they know the right answer is they ought to be friendly. And yet their brain just triggered an emotional response at the precognitive level. See, recognize that. So I'm actually pulling images before you've had a cognitive thought. I am pulling images at the precognitive level. I am pulling the emotional load associated with your decision. Social science says that about 95% of the time, your final decision matches your emotional load associated with that trigger. In other words, we made the decision before we really made the decision. And when we start to think about it, all we do is justify and rationalize.
So that decision is coming from the limbic subconscious part of the brain?
That's correct. And the sad part is that emotions fit into 2 categories, explicit and implicit. And you may not be aware of the emotional load behind that decision. It's an implicit memory. It's something that's buried deep in your storyline that has not emerged.
You know, one of the best lines of description of this, Robert McKee, the legendary screenwriting coach, I sat through his 4-day story seminar in the LAX Sheridan about, 8 years ago. And he said, our conscious mind is simply the public relations department for our subconscious mind where all the real decisions are being made.
Yeah.
So in your assessment, then, it's saying, I'm well liked by lots of people. Someone might say, yes, that's me, but their subconscious mind is saying, no, actually, you probably feel like you could use more friends.
That's correct. And so these are just pointing out, it's smoke, and you're looking at the items. Then we look at the statistical analysis of those items. If they're starting to tell us the same story, then that's an item that we may want to address and improve. So it's a constant improvement process.
So socially acceptable is one of the 4 outcomes. What's another one?
Another one is a validation, but it's a neutral reaction. And so we have an item that people are responding in the middle, and their brain is also responding with mixed emotional load. And what we call these items statistically are items that have very low discrimination value. It doesn't help us a lot when people put things in the middle. You can't categorize them in one box or the other. And so they have low discrimination when we do a statistical analysis, and the brain doesn't know what to do with them either.
So then what's the third outcome?
The third are items that originally when assessments were made, we didn't maybe know as much about assessments as we do now. And so people used to think that it really would be good to keep people on their toes if we had a double negative or reversed items. And so the question says, I am not a good leader. And the brain all of a sudden starts flipping back and forth. I'm a good leader, but it's asking me if I'm not a good leader. It's confusing.
I found that, by the way, in the assessment, some of those questions. if you agree with this or not, but the double negatives threw me a little bit too. I'm like, oh, that's not the way we normally communicate. I've got to think about the right answer. Even so much so that through the assessment, which I don't know, took a half hour, 40 minutes on there, I was even wondering if my brain was toggling back and forth and messing with the outcome because it's not how I normally communicate or process information.
And keep in mind that we were collecting your brain activity up to and including the moment that you clicked on your answer. So we know that flipping. We can document that flipping back and forth.
And then what's the final outcome you look for of the 4?
You should never in a talk say that there are 4 things and then you actually have to realize that there have to be 4. I don't recall the 4th.
No problem. So you've been doing these scans and really you started developing them in 2011. When did you really put them into effort? I mean, did it take a year before you had it finalized to the point that you were relying and confident on the information you were getting from them?
Well, this is, again, in the academic world. So we write up our protocols, we collect pilot data. That pilot data then gets put out in the form of peer-reviewed journal articles. It gets put out in the form of international and national presentations to peer groups. And they then help us refine that. Mm-hmm. And I would say that refinement continues to this day. So am I happy that I have a final product that will never alter? No. We're constantly improving. We're constantly finding new things. We're constantly investigating in new ways.
So in the last 6-7 years, since you have been getting all of this data in, and you are a continuous learner, what has been your aha moments or your surprises that you have seen coming out of this? And what do you think does it reveal about the human condition and the stories we tell ourselves?
I think we just started the whole talk over. Okay, it started with a gentleman who uses our assessment, came to me and he said, I have a favor to ask. And remember my degrees in science? I mean, I've lived my life with this code of facts. And he said, I have just returned from India and I'm a different person. I'm reborn. And I am paying for my colleagues in the business to go to India, and I want you to do a study of their brain. And sadly, they had already made arrangements to go to India, and I couldn't do a pre-post. But I agreed that I would run a scan on them post. So I did not have a comparison, a foundation, but I did have the end. So they had 28 days doing whatever they did in India. I didn't know. But supposedly they were being reborn, and supposedly they were learning something called meditation. And then the data came in. And all of a sudden I realized there's something different here. I could not get these people to switch to the negative side of the prefrontal cortex. They wouldn't trigger. All they would do is lessen the positive side. They wouldn't switch to the negative side. And they were just calm. They were like monks, I mean, that's a stereotype, but mm-hmm. they had this ability to do something that totally intrigued me. And I didn't understand it. And I started to think, in the business world, we spend more and more time talking about something that we don't know how to address at all. It's called stress and anxiety and job performance that's related to emotional components. And yet I have this group of people that have just eliminated all of that. And so I have to say the biggest aha for me has been now several years of serious reading associated with changing mindsets, producing positive mindsets, eliminating and reducing stress and anxiety through protocols as simple as breathing exercises. And the data is fascinating.
The protocols as simple as breathing exercises, meditation, yoga, I suppose, anything that kind of falls into the ancient Eastern studies of the mind and how to control them. Have you ever read the book Trying Not to Try?
Yes.
Fabulous book. It compares, Eastern methodology in all of these, and Confucianism, Stoicism, and that sort of thing, with science and modern MRI work and that sort of thing. So it's kind of what you were experiencing as well, I guess.
Yeah, my most recent book that I just wrote a book review for a journal. I picked it up only because of the first author on it. You see, the assessment you took the other day is called emotional quotient, and the emotional quotient is built around Daniel Goleman's EI, or emotional intelligence. So the concept of emotional intelligence is certainly something we study, and all of a sudden I see that he's got a new book out. So Daniel Goleman, and it's called Altered Traits. And I have to tell you, it was a fabulous book. And what it is Daniel Goleman is involved in EQ, but you see, all of my work is based on the asymmetry of the prefrontal cortex, and that research base all comes from a gentleman called Richard Davidson. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I see a book that's authored by the two of them. And it's a book about the science behind meditation. And it was an awesome read for me. And it tied together and made me, see, I don't even know if I would have admitted that I had this pursuit 6-8 months ago, because I'm enough of a scientist that I didn't feel I knew enough to be able to talk about woo-woo. You used that word earlier.
Mm-hmm. So now you have the permission to use it.
I have permission because I'm starting to see it. I saw it in my own research, and now I'm reading other research associated with it. And so I'm pursuing it in my own way. In other words, you should ask me, and the answer is no. Do you meditate? No. Do you do yoga? No. I study it, but I'm going to get there. I promise I'm going to get there. It's sort of like...
What do you think is holding you back from doing it?
Being a scientist.
Yeah.
I don't like things touching me. I like to study things. I don't like to touch them.
So your brain is firing on, it's not asymmetrical right now. On one hand, you want to do it. On the other hand, it's saying you can't do it because you're a trained PhD scientist.
Yes, and I have to tackle that. And I'm slowly tackling it. Here's an example. I started, I've never played a musical instrument. I started about 4 years ago playing a Native American flute. And I learned to play that flute as a scientist. I was religious. I spent 15 to 20 minutes every day. I did my practice. I learned my scales. I learned to read music. I learned to play the flute. And then somebody comes along and says, I don't know any of that. And I listen to them, and it's beautiful. And they say, I just play from my heart. And I said, what's that called? And they said, it's called improv. And I said, okay, I'm going to do improv. So I run into the person a few weeks later, and they say, how's your improv going? And I say, I've read 3 books on it. It's really, and they hit their head on the wall. You don't learn to improv by reading books. You don't learn to meditate by reading about meditation. We have got to let some of these things touch us.
Isn't that fascinating? I mean, it's your left brain, your left brain cognitive side.
I'm fighting it.
Let me study it, and your right brain and your heart is gut to saying, no, let me actually take over here, but you're just having a hard time letting that happen. Which leads me to the next question. In your studies of the mind, and I was just talking to Luis Medina, a brilliant creative mind here in town that we do a lot of work with together on brand storytelling and creation. And we were talking last night over beers about the science and the study of the gut, and how much of our wisdom is actually coming from our abdomen, our guts, than our brain. I don't know if you hold any truth in that, or if you have seen or experienced that in the studies that you've done.
Oh, now we've got our third podcast going.
Yeah.
Again, I would say, just like the book I just talked about with Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson.
Science Behind Meditation.
Yes, they have written that book, but they have spent a lifetime studying and spending their professional life on the periphery. And they are coming out now and admitting, they're sort of closet meditators. They're really admitting to the world that their love all along has been meditation. I would say that there are 3 of us, and they're involved in the Wednesday conference calls, that are serious about studying this. And I can tell you that the research is out there. It's not enough of it, but it's really fascinating that intuition may in fact have a basis in this huge neural net associated with our gut. And guess what? It doesn't stop there. The heart also has a huge neural net that we don't understand. And it seems to be associated with passions of certain kinds and compassion.
That totally makes sense. And if you then think about our overall biology, it's all electricity. It's all energy. So we can get in and try to logically understand how that energy is working and study it. And in other cases, we just don't know enough yet that we have to go with our intuition. It feels right. It seems right. Yeah. So let's keep going down this path to see what we can uncover.
Yeah, and I guess all of us, starting with myself, have to be willing to allow intuition to play into our decisions and not wait for the facts to be in place. We have to be willing to take that blind step forward based on only a gut feeling and a belief that we're pursuing truths.
Yeah, and when you were just saying that, it just occurred to me that my greatest stress and stressors don't come from my intuitive thoughts, my acting on intuition. It comes from my logical side when I then start second guessing my actions. That's where the stress comes in versus just believing in that intuition and going with it.
I don't know if I can remember the quote, but it used to hang on my office door at the university. It's not what you think that matters. It's not what I think that matters. It's what I think you think that seals my fate.
Yeah.
Overthinking.
That is so true.
Overthinking. Just analyzing to the point where you're locked.
Yeah, that is so true. Final question for you. Was anything more revealed in my brain scan that I need to know about and maybe run around the corner and do something about it?
Well, first of all, recognize that we are not clinical, so we don't deal in that realm. And secondly, I don't expose. Each of these debriefs are done individually. I really said what is exciting to me, and that is that you have some baselines that are just absolutely beautiful. So you have a left hemisphere, which is an acceptance and a very calm brain to start with. When you talk about some negative things in your life, like a complicated life, it's flaring. That's something that's a trigger for you. You're recognizing the complexity of your daily lived lives. It's there. So they're flaring in the right directions. They're telling a story, but the story is one that you already know. There's no hidden agendas here.
Oh, well, that's good to hear because it doesn't always feel that calm on the outside when looking in. Now, I am so excited because Candace and your team there invited me to present at your 30th annual, looks like, conference coming up here in January in Phoenix, the TTI Success Insights International Conference. And I will be talking about storytelling, the stories we tell ourselves, especially as we're creating our brands. And you have several thousands of leadership coaches and consultants from around the world that use your product, use the Trimetrics assessment, and use the knowledge gained through Target Training International to build their businesses. What does that conference look like to you? Or can you kind of describe it to our listeners? And who can attend? Can anybody come to this? Or do you have to be just, certified agents of TTI?
Well, you can contact us. We're starting a new component that we actually are opening up on Friday. We will have an opportunity for business leaders to participate in an open forum on the Friday component. And then our regular consultants are going to be involved in the rest of the conference. So, if you have an interest in this, please pursue it. But when they're called value-added associates, when the people that use our assessment show up, it actually is one of the most exciting events that I've ever experienced. Because I've gone to conferences all over the world. I present at conferences. But when we come to our conference, it's a different animal. There are ground rules. And the ground rules are not hard to live with. They're beautiful ground rules. And one of the ground rules is, yes, we're all competitors here because each of us are trying to run a business, basically doing the same thing that the guy beside you are doing. But when you enter this conference, we are all family. And we are here to help everyone be successful. and that there is enough work out there for every one of us. And so we are here to share openly with each other so that we all gain. And we are not just waiting for the podium to give us insights, but we will have conversations that we will take away a wealth of knowledge because each of us are here to share. And when you set the tone for that kind of thing to experience, beautiful things happen. It reminds me, frankly, of why I am a Nebraska football fan, even though we have not even won a game yet this year. Because when you go to a Nebraska football game, the very first game I attended, we lost to Oklahoma on the last play. You would think the entire stadium would, throw up their hands in disgust and walk home angry. The entire stadium did a standing ovation.
Because they're just all a part of the Nebraska Cornhusker community?
Yes, and they understand that being supportive is not based on winning. Being supportive is making sure that everyone wins.
And who comes to your conference? Are these just all leadership coaches?
No, they fit in several categories. We have a number of people that use our assessments in professional coaching. We have another group that use them in selection. So they are helping businesses actually get the right people, and they run benchmarks to determine what soft skills and hard skills are required. They use our assessments then to help identify the best people. My brother used to say that we hire people based on hard skills and we fire them based on soft skills. And we help you identify those soft skills so there's a better match with your culture and the requirements of the job.
Mm-hmm. So anybody can.
Yeah, and so we have our VAAs that are involved, and then we have that open day that is really generic information to be shared. I need to say something else because, I want to add a component to this conversation. I don't know if you recall, but you mentioned a common friend, Kevin, Dr. Kazara, and he invited me a number of years ago to attend one of your workshops.
That's right.
And I have to tell you that the ability to, with your help, I was able to articulate stories in ways that made the story come alive. And so I'm just so excited that you're a part of this because our people and anyone that interacts with your storytelling protocols will gain immensely.
Well, thank you for that. And if you're interested in learning more about this conference and how you can attend, it is the TTI Success Insights International Conference starting on January 11th, 2019 here, JW Marriott Desert Ridge in Phoenix, Arizona. And you can learn more. We'll have this link in the show notes, but at TTISICON.com, TTISICON.com.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ron. I mean, this is so fascinating. I can't wait to be able to sit down with you and your team one-on-one and learn a little bit more about my crazy brain going on. And I know I took the assessment again after. It'll be the third time I've taken the trimetrics. So I will be eager to see how those two worlds come together. The world you peered in to through your EEG 2 days ago, and then my analog world where I jumped on and answered those questions. So it'll really be fun to see what stories am I telling myself?
Yeah, isn't that an interesting concept that the storytelling goes to a new level here, doesn't it?
Oh, it really does. Because when you say mindsets, I immediately think story, because our mindsets are totally based on the stories we're telling ourselves, right or wrong, true or false, subconscious or conscious. Mindsets are all about the stories we tell.
They sure are.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Ron, and thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. We so often just talk about the applied science and bewitchery of story as it relates to story structures and narrative frameworks and creating arcs for your story. But today we got to really dive into the applied science of story and biophysically how they impart our wisdom, how we make meaning out of the madness of being alive, and how we can use that even through techniques of meditation, yoga, exercise, eating right to kind of harness the control and the energy in our minds that create those stories so that we can, as you know, I say often, live into our most powerful stories. So if I can help you do that with your brand and your leadership development and skills, you know where to visit me over at businessofstory.com. If you found this show interesting and you've got a friend, family member, colleague, academic who doesn't believe in this stuff, thinks it's too woo-woo, meditation coaches, a leadership coach that you think would really find this information interesting, please share this link. Please share this show with them. And until next week, when we will have another marvelous story artist on like Dr. Ron, you know what to do. Remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.